In 1964, Peter Higgs had speculated the existence of the Higgs boson. It took nearly 50 years to prove him right. And once we discovered the Higgs boson, people asked him for his reaction. And he said, it's very nice to be right sometimes. It's been a very long development over the years of the technology of building machines at higher and higher energy. And the Large Hadron Collider is the one which has been energetic enough and also intense enough in terms of the particle beams to do it. It's been a long wait, but it might have been even longer. I might not have been still around. Why were we waiting so long? Why did we invest so many resources? Why were we dying to find the God particle, the goddamn particle, as some call it? What is the Higgs boson? Why is it important?
Well, perhaps I'll start by saying that the Higgs boson is not important. The Higgs boson is a particle, or a wavicle, of something called the Higgs field. The Higgs field, that's important. Very important. And so Peter Higgs, who, it should be mentioned, passed away earlier this year, and who was indeed a very lucky man to have this idea in his 30s and live to see it confirmed in his 80s. The idea of the Higgs field was really the important part. And Higgs wasn't the only one. It's important to recognize the other gentlemen who were involved in, who made parallel observations of this, the parallel theoretical observations. Yeah. And so Robert Brout and François Englert wrote a paper which was published simultaneously with Higgs' first paper. Englert survived long enough to see the discovery and be co-awarded the Nobel Prize. Brout, unfortunately, had passed away. And there were three other gentlemen who worked here in the United States, Tom Kibble, Jerry Gorelnik, and Richard Hagen. And they wrote a paper a little bit later. And because it's a little bit later, and because and perhaps because their statement about the Higgs boson per se wasn't actually correct, there was a tendency, especially in Europe in recent years, to downweigh their contribution. And so but they certainly deserve a footnote, and maybe a little more than that, because they did have the same basic idea. And another person who deserves a footnote is a condensed matter physicist by the name of Phil Anderson, who, again, guessed, without being able to show, that something like the Higgs field might exist in nature, might do something that I'll explain in a moment. But the reason Higgs, I think, became somewhat better known is that it's an accident of history in terms of other physicists who followed along behind him. But one thing that Higgs did, which the others didn't do, was he pointed out that, well, this field, like any field, would have wavicles, and that wavicle might be observable. And that wavicle is what we now call the Higgs boson, even though it's a wavicle of the Higgs field, where the Higgs field was pointed out by 6 different people. Mm-hmm. So it's a strange thing to have a particle and a field named after a person. This is not usually the way we do things. It's a funny accident of our history as a field. People have tried to rename it. I think Higgs himself was kind of embarrassed about it. I mean, it was, so sometimes people just call it the H field. I will not be able to do that. We talk about the Higgs field so much that I'm just going to call it the Higgs field in this conversation. But I think it's worth noting that, the history is more, idolizing Higgs is a little strong. But I mean, he was an important scientist, but he wasn't alone. Now, then there's the word God particle, which is particularly distasteful to me. I think it's an insult. So the second word insults religion, and the third word insults particle physics. and it's an impressive marketing ploy. And it was invented as a marketing ploy to sell books. And having just, started selling books, I understand the thinking. But and it worked. People know the God particle better than they know anything about the physics. But what's unfortunate from my perspective is not only that obviously, the Higgs boson has nothing to do with anything divine per se. What Higgs and his friends did was important not because of the particle. The particle has no role in nature. There are no Higgs particles in this room. There are no Higgs particles wandering the universe. They're very rarely created. And in fact, That's why we had to build these expensive machines to go look for them. So, whereas the Higgs field, that field is present everywhere in this room, throughout our bodies, throughout the Earth, throughout the entire universe, and it's doing something. In some sense, it is switched on. It has a value, as physicists would say, that's not zero. And it's been that way for billions of years. And the universe would be a completely different place if it weren't there and if it weren't doing what it does. And we wouldn't exist in particular. Atoms would not exist. There would be no humans, there'd be no planet. So the Higgs field is absolutely critical to life. It's one of the, you can certainly put it on the top 10 ingredients list for the universe to be as it is. And that's what Higgs and Browser-Englert and Kibble, Hagen, and Guralnick should be famous for, rather than the God particle thingy. The particle was only important as a means to an end. Physicists knew that in order to prove that Higgs and his colleagues were correct about the field, they would have to find its wavicles. There would be no other way. In some sense, the Higgs field in our ordinary lives does only one thing, and that is it assures that the electron and certain other elementary particles have a non-zero and constant rest mass. That's all it does. And since that's all it does, it's very hard to tell that it's doing it. There's no clues other than the masses themselves. And you could dispute, well, maybe the masses come from something else. How would you check? And the way you check is you whack the field and make it ripple. That's how you know there's sound in the room. One of the ways to know there's air in the room is that there's sound. One of the ways to know that there's an ocean is to look at its waves. One of the simplest ways to prove that a field exists is to find its wavicles. That's what the Higgs bosons are. And so finding examples of Higgs bosons, making Higgs bosons at a collider, you can show that you're making them, proves that the Higgs field exists. And that is really important. So the discovery of the particle per se, just another particle. But it's a particle of something very special. And that's the Higgs field. That's the context.